Gaudeamus omnes in Domino, diem festum celebrantes, sub honore sanctorum omnium.
Welcome to The Way of the Fathers, a podcast sponsored by CatholicCulture.org. I'm your host, Mike Aquilina. Well, with this episode, we begin our third series of The Way of the Fathers. In the first series, we got to know the Fathers themselves, one by one. In the second, we studied the Church's first 7 ecumenical councils. And this time, we're going to study the cities where the Church Fathers lived their memorable lives. At first, these were cities that raged against the gospel and persecuted the church. Only later did they come to faith. Each city had its own unique topography, commerce, culture, and institutions. Each city had its distinctive blend of gossip and history. Each city was different from all the others, and each became more perfectly itself through the influence of Jesus Christ. In the episodes that follow, we'll climb the hills of those cities. We'll sail into their harbors. We'll walk their streets and push our way through their bustling markets. We'll look up in awe at their titanic public works. And we'll see how all those things shaped the expression, practice, and history of the Christianity we know today. This is yet another imaginative entry into the world of the Church Fathers, the saints and sages who converted the world to Christ. And that's what this podcast is all about. During the age of the Fathers, and in their hostile cities, the Church grew at a steady rate of 40% per decade, and practices such as abortion, infanticide, and euthanasia went from commonplace to unthinkable. The Fathers have something to teach our modern church. So why should we care about their cities? Well, when the biblical prophets give us images of the life to come, they show us a heavenly city. The whole Bible ends with the glorious vision of the New Jerusalem. St. John says, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'Behold, the dwelling of God is with men.'" The New Jerusalem is a city with towering walls laid out in a perfectly rational square with gates that are never shut. The river of the water of life flows down the main street, and groves of the tree of life grow along the river, and there is no need for illumination because there is never any night. In other words, the New Jerusalem has none of the inconveniences we associate with cities. But it's definitely a city. The whole book of Revelation ends with the curse on anyone who takes anything away from the book. God will take away his share in the tree of life and in the holy city, which are described in this book. The worst thing that could possibly happen to you is that you'll be left out of the city, which is the place where the tree of life grows. Why is heaven a city? Why not a big happy farm or an unspoiled forest or even a garden, like the garden where human life began in the book of Genesis? The answer goes deep into our traditions, Western and Eastern. Start with what it means to be civilized. The word civilization means creating cities. Rightly or wrongly, we always give the city credit for everything we think of as civilized. Art, culture, literature, and of course politics, which also means life in cities, from the Greek word for a city, polis. For Christians, the idea of the city has a special resonance. Jerusalem was the seat of worship of the true God in the time before Christ. Jerusalem was where our redemption was accomplished. The image of heaven is formed on Jerusalem, a perfected Jerusalem, not the place with the smelly alleys and chronic water supply problems, but still recognizably a city. Christianity began as a religion associated with cities. In fact, the word pagan originally meant a country dweller. Later, it came to mean someone who stuck to the old religion, because most of those people, so the Christians would have said anyway, were ignorant bumpkins from the country. Of course, history doesn't always fall into the tidy patterns that would make it easy for historians to do their jobs. But as a general rule, Christianity came first to the cities. It makes sense. Cities were built where they were because they were accessible. They were on major sea or land routes, and any traveler who came to a new province would end up in a city first. Any traveler who was bursting with good news would spill it first in a city. The book of Revelation, where we saw heaven portrayed as a glorious city, begins with messages to the churches in 7 cities: Patmos, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. These were all substantial cities in Asia Minor, modern Turkey. And they certainly weren't the only ones. 2 others might come to mind right away: Ephesus, where there was a church to which St. Paul wrote a letter, and Tarsus, which St. Paul tells us was no mean city. He came from Tarsus, and he was proud of it. In the New Testament, then, we see that Christians tended to see the world as a speckling of cities across the face of the land. But this was not just a Christian point of view. The Christians thought of the world that way because that was the way the Roman world thought of itself. The Roman Empire was governed more or less as an association of cities. This is key to understanding a lot of what we read about in history. For example, a city that had a destructive riot might be punished. There might even be indiscriminate massacres of its residents. We saw that in at least one episode of our first season. All the citizens of Thessalonica were guilty of rioting because the city was guilty as a unit. Similarly, when Paul was in Ephesus, he provoked a near riot by the silversmiths, who made souvenirs for the pilgrims to the shrine of Artemis there. When the town clerk calmed the crowd down, he said to them, "Look, we are in danger of being charged with rioting today, there being no cause that we can give to justify this commotion." This was apparently enough to make the mob go home. They had been reminded that the whole city could suffer if there was a breach of the peace. On the other hand, even under the emperors we usually think of as the crazy ones, like Nero or Caligula, life might be very comfortable and secure across most of the empire. That was because the emperor wasn't doing the day-to-day governing. Most of the government that people actually came into contact with was the government in their local town or city, a government they themselves had some influence over. Rome was no longer a republic, but the empire was in its way a collection of thousands of little republics. By one ancient count, the Roman Empire was made up of 5,627 local municipalities. 5,627. Each of those cities usually controlled a certain part of the countryside around it. This was where the rich had their factory farms and their summer estates. It was where fresh produce for the city dwellers came from. Generally, when you passed out of the control of one city, you passed into the control of another. Now we understand it a little better when the Acts of the Apostles gives us a picture of the Christian faith spreading from city to city. And in every city, the apostles start at the synagogue. The rest of history seems to bear out this picture. We can't always put names to the first Christians who evangelized in a particular place. Except for the people mentioned in Acts and a few bare names in Paul's letters, that first generation is mostly anonymous. But in every city in the Roman Empire, Christians seem to have begun with the synagogue. This was because they saw themselves as fulfilling the Jewish tradition, fulfilling the expectations of Israel, not forming a new religion. They began with the people they thought of as their own, trying to show them that the law and the prophets had been fulfilled, just as Moses, Isaiah, and the rest had promised. Every city of any size had a Jewish community. This was partly because Jews in Roman times were enterprising traders and travelers, but probably even more because every city had some people from everywhere in the Roman Empire. Wherever there was a Jewish community, there was a synagogue, or more than one synagogue if the community was large. The temple was in Jerusalem, and that was the center of Jewish worship until it was destroyed in the year 70. It was the only place where sacrifices could be offered to God. But it wasn't possible for a Jew in Rome or Alexandria or Carthage to get to Jerusalem every week. Thus, the Jewish communities built synagogues, meeting places where Jews would gather to hear the scriptures read and explained. One thing that seems to have been a regular feature of synagogue meetings was inviting interesting travelers to speak a few words of wisdom. The apostles made use of this custom when they were spreading the good news. Paul, for example, was invited to speak in the synagogue at Perga. It says, "On the Sabbath day they went into the synagogue and sat down. After the reading of the law and the prophets, the rulers of the synagogue sent to them, saying, 'Brethren, if you have any word of exhortation for the people, say it.' So Paul stood up and motioning with his hand said, 'Men of Israel, and you that fear God, listen.'" We see the same thing throughout Paul's journeys. It happened at Iconium and Thessalonica and Berea and Athens and Corinth and Ephesus. There, at Ephesus, Paul entered the synagogue and for 3 months spoke boldly, arguing and pleading about the kingdom of God. When the Acts of the Apostles mentions these synagogues, we sometimes see two groups of people, Jews and devout persons, or Jews and Greeks. Here we see another important fact about the synagogues in cities across the Roman Empire. There were many people who were not Jews who nevertheless worshipped the God of Israel and came to the synagogue to hear the scriptures. These God-fearers were a big part of the first Christians' audience. From the apostles, they heard about the way. They heard that the long-promised Messiah had come, and how there was no longer any distinction between Jew and Greek. This was a very attractive proposition to people who had always been not quite full members of the synagogue. There were Gentile converts to Judaism in every city that had a synagogue, and it seems likely that many of them were among the earliest and most enthusiastic converts to the way. The Roman cities were widely scattered on the planet, and they had much in common, much that was Roman, or that was simply human. But each city also had its own individual culture. Most of them, in fact, predated the Roman Empire by centuries. They imported what they liked from the Romans, but they kept their own ancient traditions as well. Naturally, the Jewish communities in each of those cities developed in different ways, ways that reflected the cultures of the cities around them. The Christian communities, in turn, came out of the Jewish communities with some of their traditions, and Christians adapted to the atmosphere of the city around them. This is what makes it worth taking a closer look at some of these cities. How did the church come to be what it is today? How did the differences between East and West begin? Where did our most ancient traditions come from? How did Catholic theology find its intellectual foundations? If we want answers to those questions, we have to look at the different cities where the early church grew up. We have to understand what was different about them as well as what they had in common. So we'll have more information when we're done, and that information will be useful in understanding our faith. But it's also going to be a lot of fun. There are mysteries to solve, great stories to tell, and plenty of fascinating questions to think about. As I said, we'll look at a dozen cities or so, and we'll start in our next episode in Jerusalem, the holy city where the church was born. We'll go from there to Antioch, where the disciples were first called Christians. We'll make our way to Rome, as Peter did and Paul did. We'll allegorize in Alexandria, because that's what Christians did there when they weren't rioting. We'll trek to Ephesus and beyond the Roman Empire to Edessa. We'll visit Lugdunum in what is now France and the Italian cities of Milan and Ravenna. We'll find our way to Carthage, the big city of North Africa, which was one of the most important centers of Latin culture. We'll even venture to Echmiadzin in Armenia, and of course we'll enter Constantinople, the capital of the Eastern Empire from the 4th century onward. These certainly aren't the only important places in early Christian history. It was hard whittling down my list to just this many. But we have to stop somewhere, or the series would never end. And since we have to start somewhere, we'll start with Jerusalem the next time we're together. I think you'll enjoy this entire journey. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of The Way of the Fathers, and if you did, I ask you to consider making a donation to help us. We are entirely listener-funded, and so we are utterly dependent on you. So please go now to our donation form at catholicculture.org/donate/audio. We're grateful for anything you can give. And remember, we pray for our benefactors every day. I thank you for listening.
De quorum solemnitate gaudent angeli et collaudant filium Dei.
Way of the Fathers is a production of CatholicCulture.org. Check out our other podcasts, including Catholic Culture audiobooks, bringing to life classic Catholic writings, Criteria, the Catholic Film Podcast, featuring deep analysis of great films from a Catholic perspective, and the Catholic Culture Podcast, an interview show exploring Catholic arts, culture, and issues. You'll find all of this, as well as Catholic news, commentary, liturgical year resources, and much more at CatholicCulture.org.